The autumn of 1986 settled over the small, secluded village of Inekami with a particular kind of chill. Nestled deep within the mountains of Honshu, the village was a place of old traditions and quiet routines, where the modern world felt distant. The nights grew longer, and a thick, persistent fog would roll down from the forested slopes, blanketing the narrow roads and rice paddies in a shroud of grey. It was a fog that muffled sound and played tricks on the eyes. Street lights, few and far between, cast weak haloed glows that seemed only to deepen the surrounding darkness rather than illuminate it. It was on one such night, under the flickering gaze of a solitary lamppost on the winding mountain pass, that the sightings began. A presence was felt before it was seen, a sudden, inexplicable coldness, a strange silence where there should have been the hum of insects or the rustle of leaves. Drivers navigating the treacherous curves of the old road would later speak of this feeling. It was a primal sense of being watched, a weight in the air that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. The world outside their car windows seemed to fall away, leaving only the hypnotic ribbon of asphalt and the dense, swirling mist. It was in this unnerving stillness that a figure first appeared, a dark shape standing motionless against the backdrop of the impenetrable fog. He did not move, he did not wave, he simply stood. The initial reports were disjointed, dismissed as tricks of the light or products of weary minds. A truck driver on a late-night delivery, a young couple returning from a nearby town. Each story was nearly identical. They would see a man standing by the side of the road, always in the same spot just beyond the sharpest bend. He was dressed in what looked like a dark, old-fashioned suit, something out of place for the rural setting. His posture was unnaturally rigid, his arms held stiffly at his sides. He never seemed to react to the approaching headlights, forcing drivers to swerve instinctively to avoid a collision they were sure was imminent. The encounters were fleeting, lasting only a few seconds. But the image was seared into the minds of those who saw it. The man's face was pale, almost luminous in the faint light, yet his features were indistinct, as if blurred by the fog itself. His eyes were the most terrifying detail. They were described as dark, empty voids, devoid of any discernible emotion or recognition. They were not the eyes of a living person, they were the eyes of something else entirely. Something that watched the world pass by with a chilling, detached stillness. As quickly as he appeared, he would be gone, swallowed by the rearview mirror and the relentless fog. Kenji Tanaka was a salesman for a small electronics company based in a neighboring prefecture. His route often took him through the winding mountain roads that threaded through the Inekami region. On a Tuesday night in late October 1986, he was running late, pushing his small sedan through the thick, disorienting fog. The air was cold, and the only sounds were the rhythmic swish of his windshield wipers and the low hum of the engine. He knew this road well, but the fog made every turn feel unfamiliar and treacherous. A sense of unease had been creeping over him for the last few kilometers, a strange, unfounded anxiety that made him grip the steering wheel tighter. It was just after 11 p.m. when he rounded the sharpest curve on the pass, a place local superstitions warned against. His headlights cut a swathe through the mist, and there he was, a man standing perfectly still on the narrow shoulder of the road. Tanaka's heart leaped into his throat. He slammed on his brakes, the tires screeching on the wet asphalt. The car swerved violently, its rear end fishtailing before coming to a stop mere meters from the figure. The man had not flinched. He stood as if rooted to the spot, a dark silhouette against the swirling white. His face was turned towards the car, but it was a blank, passive mask. Tanaka sat frozen, his breath catching in his chest. The silence was absolute. He couldn't even hear the crickets. The man's eyes, even from that distance, seemed to bore right through him. They were dark, lifeless pools that reflected no light. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over Tanaka. This was not a person in need of help. This was something else, something wrong. His car radio, which had been playing softly, suddenly erupted in a burst of static, a harsh, grating sound that shattered the quiet. His headlights began to flicker, casting the scene in a strobe-like, nightmarish light. Every instinct screamed at him to flee. With a trembling hand, Tanaka jammed the car into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The engine sputtered for a moment as if struggling against some unseen force before roaring back to life. He wrenched the wheel, speeding past the stationary figure without daring to look back. He drove for what felt like an eternity. His eyes glued to the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. The figure had not moved, had not pursued. It had simply been there, and then it was gone, vanished back into the fog from which it had emerged. Tanaka didn't stop driving until he reached the bright, reassuring lights of the next town, his body shaking uncontrollably. Word of Kenji Tanaka's experience spread slowly at first. A hushed story told over warm sake in the village's only izakaya. But soon others came forward. An elderly farmer, taking his sick wife to the clinic before dawn, spoke of seeing the same figure. He described the man's suit as being oddly formal, like that of a salaryman from the city, but it was weathered and seemed out of time. He noted the man's unnatural stillness, how not even a gust of wind seemed to stir his clothing. The farmer, a man who had lived in the mountains his entire life, was not prone to flights of fancy. His testimony gave the growing legend a heavy dose of credibility. The atmosphere in Inekami began to change. The familiar, comforting quiet of the nights now felt menacing. A collective anxiety took hold of the community. People started avoiding the mountain pass after dusk, opting for longer, safer routes. The flickering streetlights, once just a minor annoyance, were now seen as omens. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden shape. The sound of the wind whistling through the tall cedar trees was no longer just the wind. It was a whisper, a precursor to an encounter. The fog was no longer a simple weather phenomenon. It was a curtain, behind which something waited patiently. The details shared by the witnesses were disturbingly consistent. The figure was always male, always alone, and always motionless. He appeared in the same general area, a 100-metre stretch of road known for its poor visibility and sharp turns. No one ever saw him arrive or leave. He was simply there, a fixed point in a shifting world. Some drivers reported their car engines sputtering or stalling as they approached, only to restart without issue once they were past the spot. Others mentioned their radios filling with static, the familiar voices of announcers, replaced by a harsh electronic hiss that felt malevolent. The psychological toll was palpable. People felt a lingering dread, a sense of being watched even in the safety of their own homes. The children were told stories, not of monsters under the bed, but of the silent man on the mountain pass. The mystery was no longer just a collection of strange sightings. It had become an active presence in the village's psyche. It was a shared fear, a dark secret that bound the community together in a state of quiet apprehension. The nights in Inekami were no longer peaceful. They were a time of waiting, of listening for the sound of a car braking too suddenly in the distance. By early November, the rumours had become too persistent for the local authorities to ignore. The small police koban on the edge of the village, usually concerned with lost property and minor disputes, began receiving formal reports. Officer Ito, a veteran policeman nearing retirement, was tasked with looking into the matter. He was a practical, no-nonsense man, initially sceptical of what he considered to be mass hysteria fueled by superstition. He suspected a prankster was at work, or perhaps a drifter passing through the area. He assured the village elders that he would get to the bottom of the strange occurrences on the mountain pass. Ito began his investigation methodically. He interviewed each of the eyewitnesses separately, taking detailed notes. He was struck by the consistency of their accounts. The description of the man's dark suit, his pale face, his unnatural stillness, it was all the same. These were not excitable teenagers. They were sober, respected members of the community. A salesman, a farmer, a schoolteacher. Their fear seemed genuine, their memories vivid. Ito's initial skepticism began to erode, replaced by a growing sense of unease. He could dismiss one story, perhaps two, but the sheer number of similar reports was troubling. Officer Ito decided to see for himself. For several nights he parked his patrol car at a vantage point overlooking the notorious stretch of road. He sat in the cold, dark vehicle for hours, sipping lukewarm tea from a thermos, his eyes scanning the fog-drenched landscape. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of his police radio. He saw nothing. The road remained empty, save for the occasional passing vehicle. He started to think that perhaps this was all a misunderstanding, a collective delusion born from the oppressive fog and the isolation of the village. He felt a sense of relief mixed with a strange disappointment. On the third night of his vigil, something happened. He received a panicked call on the radio from a truck driver who claimed to have just swerved to avoid a man standing in the middle of the road. The location was less than a kilometre from Ito's position. He immediately started his car and raced to the scene, his blue lights cutting through the thick mist. He arrived in under a minute. The road was completely empty. He got out of his car, his powerful flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There were no footprints on the soft, damp shoulder of the road. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all. It was as if the man had simply dissolved into the air. The mystery of the stationary man was defined not only by what was seen, but also by what was felt and heard. The physical phenomena reported by witnesses added a layer of tangible scientific impossibility to the ghostly sightings. The most common report, beyond the visual encounter itself, was the sudden and inexplicable failure of vehicle electronics. Car engines would sputter and die, headlights would flicker and dim, and radios would burst into screams of white noise. These events were not random. They occurred precisely as drivers entered the zone where the figure was known to appear, and they ceased just as suddenly once the area was cleared. Mechanics in the nearby town were baffled. Several drivers, including Kenji Tanaka, brought their cars in for inspection, convinced there was a serious electrical fault. Yet, in every single case, no issues could be found. Batteries were fully charged, alternators were working perfectly, and wiring was intact. The vehicles ran smoothly under all other conditions. It was as if some external force, localized to that small stretch of mountain road, was interfering with the fundamental principles of their operation. This element of the mystery was particularly disturbing, as it moved the story from the realm of subjective perception into the world of measurable physical effect. Beyond the mechanical failures, there was the cold. Witnesses consistently described a sudden, unnatural drop in temperature inside their vehicles, even with the heaters running at full blast. It was a damp, penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from outside, seeping through the glass and steel of the car. This was often the first sign that something was wrong, a physical warning that preceded the visual appearance of the figure. The feeling was described as a graveyard cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with a sense of profound wrongness, as if the very air was being drained of its life and warmth. The most perplexing physical evidence, or rather lack thereof, was the absence of footprints. Officer Ito and other curious locals had searched the area meticulously after a reported sighting. The ground on the shoulder of the road was soft and muddy, especially after the frequent autumn rains. Any person standing there for even a few moments should have left a clear impression, yet there was never anything. Not a single scuff mark, not a displaced pebble, not a crushed blade of grass. It was as if the figure, despite its solid and imposing appearance, had no physical weight, no interaction with the ground upon which it stood. It was, in every sense but the visual one, a ghost. As the sightings continued, speculation within the village of Inekami and the surrounding areas intensified, branching into various theories, each attempting to rationalize the irrational. The most prevalent and emotionally resonant explanation was that the figure was a yurei, a Japanese ghost. This theory posited that the stationary man was the restless spirit of someone who had died tragically on that stretch of road. Perhaps it was a victim of a traffic accident, forever bound to the place of their demise, or someone who had taken their own life in the secluded woods nearby. The figure's formal suit was interpreted as the attire of a man who had met an untimely end on his way to or from work. A more scientific psychological explanation was also proposed, suggesting the phenomenon was a case of mass hysteria or a collective hallucination. Proponents of this theory pointed to the power of suggestion in a small, isolated community. Once the first story from a credible witness like Tanaka took root, the anxiety and expectation could have caused others to project their fears onto the ambiguous shapes of the fog. The mind, especially when tired and stressed from navigating a dangerous road at night, is capable of creating vivid illusions. The flickering headlights and radio static could be coincidental electrical issues, their significance amplified and woven into the growing narrative of a supernatural encounter. However, the psychological theories struggle to account for the striking consistency of the sightings. How could so many different people at different times hallucinate the exact same figure down to the detail of his dark suit and lifeless eyes? Furthermore, it failed to adequately explain the repeatable physical phenomena, such as engine failure and radio interference, which seemed to defy simple psychological projection. This led some to explore more paranormal or esoteric theories. Could the area be a window or a portal to another dimension, where a being from another reality was momentarily visible? Was it a time slip, a brief repeating echo of a past event? A darker, more sinister theory whispered among a few of the village elders was that the figure was not a ghost, but something worse. It was not the spirit of a dead human, but a malevolent entity drawn to the place for its own unknowable reasons. This entity, they suggested, was not reenacting a past tragedy, but was a predator of sorts, feeding on the fear it generated. The engine failures were not a side effect, but a deliberate act to trap or disable its victims. The figure's stillness was not passive, but patient, like a spider waiting in its web. This theory, while the most terrifying, was for some the only one that seemed to fit all the bizarre and menacing details of the case. The mystery of the stationary man did not emerge from a vacuum. The mountains and forests surrounding Inekami were steeped in centuries of folklore. Stories passed down through generations to explain the unexplainable and to warn travellers of the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. The village elders, when pressed, would nod knowingly and speak of the old tales. They spoke of the Mujina, faceless, shape-shifting spirits known to startle travellers on lonely roads. While the stationary man had a face, its blank, indistinct features and terrifying eyes bore a haunting resemblance to the void where a Mujina's face should be. The stories were a warning. Not all who you meet on the path are human. Another local legend that resonated with the sightings was the tale of the Okuribito, or the sending-off man. This was said to be a spirit that would silently follow travellers walking through the mountains at night. As long as the traveller did not look back, they would be safe. But to turn and acknowledge the presence was to invite misfortune or even death. The drivers who encountered the stationary man were, in a sense, being followed. They would see him alongside the road, and the terrifying image would follow them in their minds and their rearview mirrors. The instinct was to look back, to confirm what they saw, an act that the old legend strictly forbade. The specific location of the sightings also had its own dark history. The sharp bend on the mountain pass was known locally as Jigoku-zaka, or Hell Hill. Long before cars, it was a treacherous part of the trail where accidents were common. Stories were told of a samurai who was ambushed and killed there in a past century, and of a merchant whose cart tumbled into the ravine below. The area was considered a place where the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thin. The appearance of the stationary man seemed to many to be a modern manifestation of the ancient malevolent energy that had long clung to that particular piece of land. These folk tales provided a framework for the community to understand the terrifying events. They offered a familiar narrative for an experience that defied modern logic. By connecting the stationary man to the Mujina or the Okuribito, the villagers could place the phenomenon within their cultural context, transforming a random, terrifying event into a part of a larger, older story. It did not make the figure less scary, but it made the fear itself more understandable. It was a confirmation that the old warnings still held true, and that the modern world of cars and radios had not banished the ancient spirits from the mountains. The story of the stationary man, for a brief period, managed to escape the confines of the Inekami Mountains and attract the attention of the regional press. A small article first appeared in a prefectural newspaper, tucked away in a back section dedicated to local curiosities. The headline was "Sensational. Ghost of the Highway. Spooked drivers report phantom figure on mountain pass." The article summarized the accounts of several witnesses, focusing on the ghostly aspects of the story: the foggy nights, the lifeless eyes, the vanishing act. It treated the phenomenon as a piece of local color, a spooky tale perfect for the autumn season. This initial coverage brought a small, temporary wave of outside interest. For a few weekends, the mountain pass saw an increase in traffic. Ghost hunters and curious teenagers from nearby cities drove the winding road at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous phantom. They came with cameras and tape recorders, turning the sight of genuine terror into a destination for a cheap thrill. This brief period of notoriety was a source of annoyance for the local residents and for Officer Ito, who had to deal with the influx of reckless drivers. However, the stationary man, it seemed, was not one for performing for an audience. None of the thrill-seekers reported a definitive sighting. A television crew from a regional station even made the trip to Inekami. They interviewed a nervous-looking Kenji Tanaka, who recounted his story with a shaky voice. They filmed the foggy mountain pass at dusk, using dramatic music to heighten the eerie atmosphere. They spoke with Officer Ito, who gave a cautious professional statement about an ongoing investigation into public disturbances. The segment aired on the local evening news, but it failed to gain national traction. In a country that was rapidly modernizing and focused on its economic boom, a ghost story from a remote village was little more than a momentary distraction. Ultimately, the media's interest was as fleeting as the figure itself. With no new developments, no concrete evidence, and no one willing to go on the record with a definitive photograph or video, the story quickly died down. The reporters and ghost hunters moved on to the next sensation, and the village of Inekami was left alone once more with its mystery. The brief flash of media attention served only to document the existence of the legend before it receded back into the realm of local rumour and whispered warnings, leaving the community to face the long, foggy nights on their own. As the winter of 1986 approached, bringing snow and even more treacherous road conditions, the sightings of the stationary man grew less frequent and then stopped altogether. Whether the figure had moved on, or whether fewer people were daring to travel the pass at night, no one could say for sure. The official police investigation led by Officer Ito was quietly closed, filed away with the conclusion, cause unknown. There were no more engine failures, no more bursts of radio static. An uneasy quiet settled back over the mountain, but it was not the same peace as before. The silence was now heavy with memory. The events of that autumn left an indelible scar on the collective psyche of Inekami. The story of the stationary man became a permanent part of the village's modern folklore, a cautionary tale told to a new generation. The specific stretch of road on the mountain pass was never truly seen the same way again. Even on a bright sunny day, drivers would feel a slight chill as they rounded the sharp bend, their eyes instinctively scanning the shoulder of the road. The fear lingered, a low-frequency hum beneath the surface of daily life. The mystery was never solved. And perhaps that was the most terrifying part. There was no closure, no rational explanation to put the mind at ease. What was the stationary man? Was he the ghost of a tragic soul, a psychological projection born of fear and fog, or something else entirely, something ancient and unknowable? The questions hang in the air to this day, as thick and persistent as the mountain mist. The lack of a resolution means that any theory is as valid as the next. The figure remains a perfect enigma, a blank slate onto which anyone who hears the story can project their deepest fears about the dark, the unknown, and the lonely stretches of road that lie between the safe, well-lit places of the world. Today, on August 26, 2025, the story is mostly forgotten by the outside world, but in Inekami, it survives. The mystery endures not in newspaper archives or police files, but in the shared memory of a community that experienced something inexplicable. It serves as a chilling reminder that not all questions have answers, and that sometimes, in the dead of night, on a lonely road, you might see something that you were not meant to see. The stationary man is gone, but the dread he inspired remains, a silent, motionless presence waiting in the fog of the past.